Hello and welcome to politicseastasia.com. My name is Florian Schneider, and today I would like to talk to you about the role that digital technologies play in political communication, particularly when it comes to China. Usually digital technologies are seen either as harbingers of democracy and social change or as mechanisms that facilitate social and political control. However, such dualisms aren't always helpful for understanding what complex roles such technologies really play in our societies today. An alternative has been to view digital technologies as tools that can be used in very different ways. Take the example of a knife. You can use a knife to do harm, for instance if you stab someone in the back. However, you can also use a knife in a more benevolent way. For example, when you are cutting your birthday cake so you can share it with your friends and family. So what matters is how the knife gets used. Scholars like the French sociologist Bruno Latour even go as far to say that we should treat tools as agents in their own right, asking what does a tool do in a particular context. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether you want to attribute agency to inanimate objects or not. Now, you can probably imagine why it is useful to think along these lines when talking about digital technologies. Software programs, like for example computer operating systems or search engines, often behave according to their coding, and they do so regardless of whether there are human beings around to use them or not. However, this is not yet the full story. Tools are made by someone for some purpose. You can do, of course, a lot of creative things with a knife, but there are limits to what you can use it for. Just try to eat your soup with a knife and you'll see what I mean. In modern societies, tools are made largely by commercial enterprises, and these enterprises design tools and market them with particular goals in mind. Corporations like Google, Apple, or Facebook therefore shape what a tool can or cannot be used for. What is more, tools get designed and produced in a larger context. In most cases, production and trade takes place in capitalist economies, and that means that companies act according to the rules that govern such economic systems. The political economy behind the tools also matters. And if you think that the companies who make the tools are mainly guided by the so-called invisible hand of the market, think again. All economies are regulated in one way or another, and even the most neoliberal market systems rely on state actors to safeguard their ideals of neoliberalism. Just consider how neoliberal governments turn knowledge into a commodity by creating laws that defend so-called intellectual property rights. But how we use tools, whether digital or otherwise, does not only have to do with political and economic systems, it crucially has to do with who we are as human beings, how we were socialized, what we believe in, how we see the world, and also how our minds work. Human beings are incredibly clever animals, but we are prone to certain patterns of behavior that we are wired for. We don't like to be challenged in our worldviews, for example. We like our comfort zones. We react in specific ways to people we consider to be our friends or family, as opposed to our enemies. And all of this also affects how we do what we do. For example, when we go online and start chatting on WhatsApp or on WeChat. Let me show you a few examples of the kind of factors that influence how people use digital technologies. Let's start with the politics. The following are two word clouds that show how two very different governments try to regulate the internet. On the left, you see the words that appear most often in a 2010 speech on the subject by Hillary Clinton. On the right is a similar representation for a Chinese white paper from the same year that outlines how the Chinese government thinks about ICT. Without going into the details of the two documents, you can already see where the priorities lie. The vision of the Obama administration has everything to do with individuals, with liberty, and with cosmopolitan ideals, whereas the PRC's approach is much more about national development and about security issues. As you can probably imagine, each worldview provides the foundation for a specific political approach on how to treat digital communication. Whereas US policy is geared towards creating networked infrastructures in which hierarchies are supposed to become leveled and information flows freely, PRC policy aims to reproduce the communication patterns of traditional media, with vetted authoritative sources of information broadcasting through digital networks to a mass audience. Either of these two approaches is really only an ideal and can never be fully realized. However, they each influence how digital technologies can be deployed in particular contexts. In the Chinese case, there are many examples of how digital technology can also be used to create network structures to circumvent, for example, what the government is calling guiding public opinion along healthy and correct lines. However, the government has been very successful in creating spaces in which the combination of political incentives, economic incentives, and human idiosyncrasies does in fact create the kind of traditional media environment that the authorities have in mind. This is a representation of a specific section of China's web that I have been working on for my own research. What you see here is how websites that deal with the 1937 Nanjing massacre link to other web resources. What is interesting here is that the websites dealing with the topic hardly link to each other at all. Instead, what happens is that they link to authoritative sources or to affiliated agencies, most of which, as you can see here, are government or party institutions. We end up with isolated beacons of information that reproduce very similar resources, but without much serendipity or interactivity. The result is essentially an infoweb, something that is very much in line with how the authorities want the web to work. This is not to say that all of China's web looks like this, but it gives us an interesting impression of what a traditional media approach to digital communication can produce. And what's interesting is that you don't actually need a whole lot of heavy-handed censorship to bring such a result about. In fact, the way that conglomerates work in China, plus the way that people like to access and process information, is already doing a lot of the work. And that is true not only in China. This is a representation that the digital news outlet Quartz published in 2014. It shows two of the many echo chambers that exist online. What we are looking at here is how people discuss the 2014 Ferguson riots in Missouri on Twitter. As it turns out, one group of users supported the police and another group was highly critical of the authorities, but the two groups hardly ever interacted. They each existed in their own informational bubble. You can find very similar echo chambers on a range of controversial issues, for example the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Such outcomes are not brought about by any technical barriers, but by the ways in which human beings access, process, and share information. In that sense, censorship, propaganda, and information control in an age of digital communication are affected by a large number of different factors, ranging from political power and economic incentives to technical affordances and human psychology. Now, one of the great challenges of disciplines like digital humanities or computational social sciences is to try and figure out how we use tools like digital technologies in these complex social and political contexts. If you want to learn more about these approaches, or if you want to find out more about my research project on digital nationalism in China, take a look around here at the resources I've made available for you at politicseastasia.com.